This talk is not really the place for reminiscences, but I have to admit I was reminded of Kripke's visit to Manchester. The thing I remember was that Mary Pryor asked him, would he like a cup of tea? And he said, yes, he would. And she brought it to him. And my memory is the cup of tea getting colder and colder and colder. And I seem to remember that more than I remember the content of the talk. However, thank you for the other reminiscences. Now, we're celebrating Pryor. And it's the mark of the greatness of a philosopher that, in some sense, their legacy almost transcends what they themselves thought of it. And if you look at the effect, particularly in the realm of tense logic, if you look at the effects of what Pryor did, it has taken a life which not only is beyond what Pryor thought, but may even been a life that he might not have been as sympathetic to. Now, of course, that's a what if. If Pryor had lived and seen what had happened to tense logic, you can't extrapolate his view about model theory as it was when he died with what it might have been when he saw what happened. But what I want to do is just look at Pryor's own attitude to the model theory of intentional languages, because I'm going to list 5 interrelated features. They're the first things on the handout. 5 interrelated features of current model theoretic semantics for intentional languages, and suggest that Pryor was actually quite skeptical, had serious reservations about the metaphysical importance of every one of these things. And that's a kind of interesting fact. It's a doubly interesting fact in that I think it says a lot of Pryor and philosophy as it then was. Because as it then was, it was still in a way the days of the ordinary language movement. There was still, and I remember this as a student, there was the tension, those who liked logic and those who thought ordinary language, as though they were somehow or other at odds with each other. Subsequently, of course, we had the work of Chomsky in syntax, we had the work of Montague in semantics, where it's less clear that there is this divergence. But that, of course, post-dated Arthur's death. So all I want to do is mention these 5 things, and most of the handout, pretty well all of the handout, is some quotations from Pryor's work. It's very hard when you read Pryor's work to get any theory of what he thought was going on, and that I think too was a mark of philosophy in those years. The idea was you went and you did philosophy, and you didn't always reflect about what you were doing. If somebody says, well, what's the importance of doing this? It was almost as though that was a bad question. You had to say, look, this is interesting, this is a point that I'm making. Don't go and reflect on how it fits into something wider. So you get very little reflection on the nature of logic, the nature of meaning. And you have to piece it together from things he says from time to time. And I've tried to do this with some of his published work. Last week I've been involved in working on some of the unpublished work, some of the Nachlass, and I'm sure here there will be more things that can be said just beyond some of the things that I've done here. But let me go through these 5 ones. First of all, model theoretic semantics interprets formal language. You take a sentence of a formal language, and then in a meta-language you describe the meaning, and usually the meaning in terms of truth conditions, and that leads on to the second one. If you think of the thing we remember Wittgenstein's Tractatus for most, I think, is the truth conditional theory of meaning. And in the truth conditional theory of meaning, there are going to be every sentence. The meaning of every sentence is to be understood in terms of the conditions under which it's true, and tautologies and contradictions then end up being either true under all conditions or under no conditions. There's a little bit ambiguous from the Tractatus. In one sense, Wittgenstein seems to think they had no meaning. In another sense, he recognized they had to have meaning. But certainly, they are limiting cases of truth conditions. The second feature is that when we do semantics, we describe an object language in terms of a meta-language. We don't translate the sentences of an object language, say a language of tense language, logic, into another object language. That's not what we do in doing model theoretic semantics. The fourth feeling is that meaning is gained by recursion. Russell, back in the logical atomism lectures, notes that it's a feature of language, that you can listen to a sentence you've never heard before and work out its meaning on the basis of its syntactic structure and the meaning of its parts. And that, coupled with the truth conditional theory of meaning, is an important feature. Secondly, in terms of predicate logic, we evaluate sentences at indices, whether they're temporal indices or worlds, in terms of domains. And then the question arises of whether a predicate can be true or false of an entity in a world in which that entity is not in the domain of things that exist at that world. And if you say it can be neither true nor false, then you're going to be led to very strange logics. And so if you want to preserve a kind of classical logic as much model theory does in terms of intentional languages, then it looks like you're going to have to talk about formulae like the Barkan formula on the basis of domains of each world. Those are, I think, features which are pretty common features which in a way mark out the way model theoretic semantics for intentional languages is done. The first one is metalinguistic truth. I've given you two sentences, one and true there. Quotes Brown is ill is true if and only if Brown is ill, and it is true that Brown is ill if and only if Brown is ill. If you look at one of the works that I haven't listed in the bibliography, but I've mentioned from time to time, the Objects of Thought book, which of course was posthumous, edited by Geach and Kenny just after Pryor's death. There is a chapter on Tarski, and in the chapter on Tarski, Pryor makes the distinction between 1 and 2, and then makes it look as though he sees 2 as where it's at. 2 is the important one rather than 1. Now, of course, that means if you look at current model theoretic semantics is concerned with questions about 1 rather than 2. And then I've given you quite a long quotation, and you can look at that at your leisure, quite a long quotation in which, although Pryor is aware of the difference, and although it looks as though he starts off by talking about, as though he's going to address questions of the form 1 there, in a way it's less clear to me that he doesn't end up being more interested in questions of the form more like 2. So that's one respect, I think, in which his emphasis at least seems to me to be a little bit different from the emphasis in 1. If we move on to 2, that's meaning and truth conditions. If you take the Wittgensteinian line, then there are going to be tautologies and contradictions. If every sentence has truth conditions, then there are going to be some sentences true under no conditions, other sentences true under all conditions, and in a way the logical truths, the logical necessities, are going to be those which are true under all conditions. If that's right, then the job of logic is to study a certain kind of statement, a statement that is true under all conditions. When you look at Pryor's attitude to logic, it doesn't look as though that is his view about what the purpose of logic is. And I've given you a quotation, a paragraph from What is Logic, where he talks about a logic of organic life, where the formulae in that logic are perfectly contingent formulae. And he seems to think that any body of truth that can be formally systematized is going to count as a logic. There isn't any hint in that of the distinction between necessary truths in the Wittgensteinian sense and contingent truths. It looks as though Pryor's view of logic wasn't a view that was based on that. He does later, in the second quotation that I've given to you, he says that, look, some writers have attempted to represent modal logic as a kind of disguised quantification theory. Now, in fact, although you don't quite get this in the Tractatus, the idea in the Tractatus seems to be that the meaning of every sentence is the conditions under which it's true. It's then a fairly short step to thinking of modality as quantification over conditions, and that's, of course, what happens in the possible world semantics. And it's clear that Pryor always had reservations about that. He thought it had some technical use, and he talks at one point about a more expensive than relation between teacups as being used as a model for independence proofs or something in modal logic. It's also true not in the original runabout inference paper itself, but in one that says Conjunction and Contunction Revisited, where there he talks a bit about tonk, and I don't want to have anything to say about tonk, but he also talks about contunction. He talks about the use of truth tables as giving a meaning as on a par with the use of introduction and elimination rules as given the meaning. And he talks about the operator he calls contunction, and that's at the top of your second page. A contunction sign is one which, when placed between any two sentences, P and Q, forms a sentence which is true when P is true, false when Q is false, and therefore, of course, both true and false when P is true and Q is false. A simpler version, the one that I've given you there, star, that's not in prior, but if you were to say for any proposition P, star P is true if P is true, and star P is false if P is true, it's quite clear if you think of truth tables, there cannot be a truth table. We don't need to, there just is no truth table. So whatever, why did Prior think there might have been? I think because he thinks that, look, 10 actually tells you under what conditions is star P true, namely if P is true, and under what conditions is star P is false, namely if P is true. But of course, if you try to produce a truth table, you just can't do that. So, and I mention that because truth tables, most intentional logics, the ones that are based on classical logic, will have the normal rules for the truth functional operators will be part of the meaning. Of course, it's truth at an index, but truth at an index, classical truth at an index reflects truth tables. So Prior clearly had reservations even about the use of truth tables. He also has this et operator, which is P et Q is true if and only if either P is true and Q is true, or Oxford is the capital of Scotland. Now, since Oxford isn't the capital of Scotland, the truth table you get for that is exactly the same as the truth table you get for conjunction, at least in the actual world. Now, Prior doesn't, of course, diagnose that as its problem, but one of the problems is that the P et Q is and in the actual world, but would be something else in another possible world. The other feature that I mentioned was that model theoretic semantics doesn't involve translation. David Lewis once made fun of semantics as being a translation into a language that he called semantic marqueese. If you actually look, though, at, for example, some of the pages in formal logic, he says, and that's a quote from Prior, if we use the symbol 1 to stand indifferently for any true proposition and 0 for any false one, the special features of negation can be summed up by the following equations. And those equations certainly make it look as though you're adding 1 and 0 as symbols to your language, and then your truth tables are actually being done by successively replacing them. And even more elaborately, in past, present, and future, you've got the U calculus, and it's fairly clear from that Prior is thinking of translating a sentence in the object language of tense logic into a sentence in an object language which has these symbols, these additional symbols in it. So the kind of symbols that are subsequently called nominals. So in a sense there, Prior is talking about translation rather than semantics. So that's one other difference between what Prior is doing and the way he seems to think about it and the way model theoretic semantics is doing it. The notion of recursiveness was made much of by Donald Davidson following Tarski, the idea that a theory of meaning is a way of predicting the truth or the truth conditions of complex sentences on the basis of the truth conditions of their simpler parts. Prior wrote a critical notice in mind of Tarski, and there it looks like he says everyday or colloquial language isn't the sort of language in which the sense of its sentences is entirely determined by the sense of their parts. So he clearly thinks that ordinary language doesn't work. Now, he does say entirely determined, and of course it's true that in the case of ordinary language, as Chomsky pointed out, there is what you might call the surface level and an underlying level. So sentences like everybody loves somebody, or visiting relatives can be dangerous, or whatever. There are sentences whose surface grammatical structure doesn't always give you a clue to the underlying logical structure. That's all Prior may have meant, but I suspect that Prior is tending to suggest, and the tone of that notice suggests that he thought that what Tarski had done for formal languages, namely giving a truth specification of the complex sentences in terms of their parts, what Tarski had done for formal languages wasn't the sort of thing you should be doing for colloquial languages. He then goes on to make the point that we shouldn't think of Tarski as defining truth. He doesn't. You have to already know what truth is, what it means to say that something is true. I think his criticism of Tarski there is right, and I think we really should. We shouldn't think of Tarski as defining what truth is, but as saying, look, if we know what it is to say that something is true, then we need an explanation of how the truth conditions of complex sentences depend on the truth conditions of their parts. One particularly difficult area for recursive semantics is in the case of belief sentences. You've got, Prior does discuss Russell's example, which I've given you as 12 and 13. Othello believes that Desdemona loves Cassio. Desdemona loves Cassio. Normally, if we do that in some version of recursive semantics, we need to get a meaning for Desdemona loves Cassio, a meaning for believes, which relates Othello to the proposition that Desdemona loves Cassio, and feed that in. A large part of objects of thought is designed to say that this isn't a good idea. When you actually look at what Prior's own view amounts to, it's very revealing in a paragraph in which he allies himself with Quine, where it looks as though he says, if you look at that quotation there, he says, Tom believes that Cicero denounced Catiline, that's Quine's example, that Quine suggests that this is of the form FA, which it's basically like the predicate F is a simple predicate, which means believe denouncing that Tom, the A, Tom satisfies the predicate, believed that Othello, believed that Cicero denounced Catiline. So it's as though you had a predicate F, subscript, believe Cicero denounced Catiline, Tom. And that's a simple. Now, if that's right, one thing that is clear is that the meaning of that sentence, then, the meaning of the sentence that Prior is attributing as is suggesting as the logical analysis of belief sentences, is going to be one in which there is no recursive specification of the meaning of the whole sentence in terms of the meaning of its component parts, or at least it suggests there that Prior is advocating a solution which does not seem easily or happily to let itself for this to recursive specification. Finally, in the case of predicate logic, one of the things you find when you read formal logic, when you read Prior's works, is you don't really have any idea of domains. He does discuss it a little bit. He says in the tenseless language of Quine and Smart, he is aware through the views of Quine and Smart that you could have a whole domain of past, present and future things. You could say that sentences are true at an instant, and if you do that, maybe your domain of discourse does not have to be things that exist at any particular time. And he suggests maybe something like that will work, but he doesn't like it. He doesn't like it for metaphysical reasons. He doesn't like the idea that if something does not exist at a certain time, there can be anything true of that time. At one point, Elizabeth Anscombe, in her essay on Aristotle, says that she's even heard it said that there may be a problem in sentences true about things that no longer exist, as if, she says, as if a man could not be famous when he is dead. I don't know whether she had Prior in mind. This was written in a 1963 essay. She may have been remembering Prior's time and modality lectures. I don't know, but certainly that's what she says there. The other point that Prior notes when he's talking about Tarski is that Prior states the truth conditions for quantified sentences in terms of the very language that you're defining there. If you look at 14, pi x phi x is true if and only if pi x phi x. And he states this. So all I've tried to do here is give you 5 features which seem to me pretty common features of current model theoretic semantics, and show that Prior himself actually had very serious reservations, whether they were metaphysical reservations, whether they were logical reservations, very serious reservations about all of these. Now, I'm presenting this as a historical feature. It may look as though you might say that those of us who are fans of current model theoretic semantics might regard this as criticism. But two observations I would make. First, we don't know what Prior's attitude would have been had he lived. Secondly, in a way, I think it's a mark of a philosopher that it's even greater in a philosopher that what they started out with can have consequences that they themselves might not have been happy with. There's a certain sense in which that doesn't, in my view, make the philosopher less great. It almost makes them more great.
Thank you, Max, for this stimulating talk where you address a major theme and one that became increasingly important towards the end of Prior's life and work, because at that time model theory, of course, grew and grew. So these are important questions. Does anybody have a question for Max?
On the right at the bottom of your first page, you have a quote where he says about quantification over possible states of affairs. I don't myself think this will do either, though I won't develop my objections to it now. My question is, do you know anywhere where he developed more fully the objections?
Well, at one point in the appendix to Past, Present, and Future, he says he doesn't like instants because of their abstract nature. And I think also, if you look at the tone of Objects of Thought, the argument is entirely, I think it's not liking abstract entities. And the other interesting thing about Objects of Thought is that there is the chapter on Platonism, where he suggests that Platonism is introducing abstract entities in place of parts of speech, which is it's one of the things I'm trying to make sense of at the moment. I think you can make more sense of it. It looks, at first sight, it just looks like a use-mention confusion. That why introduce, what he means is something like, instead of saying I'm here because I wanted to, it's my being here is caused by my wanting to, so that you have a relation between two things. And the Platonist says, therefore, there must be my being here and there must be my wanting to, and there's a relation between them. Whereas for Prior, I came here because I want to simply connect 2 sentences. And he really did think that if you did it in terms of sentences, you were not committed to entities. So I think that, and therefore I think he thought that the things like the U-calculus and introducing instants was committing you to metaphysical entities the way the tense logic with operators didn't. Now, so the clearest bit that I remember, there may be more, but the clearest bit I remember is saying my objection to instants is because of their abstractness. And it's important to remember that, yes, he had objections to possible worlds, but in a sense, for many philosophers who object to possible worlds are not going to object to moments of time. Now, Prior's objection to moments of, so I think people probably realize if you object to possible worlds, well, shouldn't you also object to moments of time? And of course, Prior did. Mm-hmm. So.
Yes, Hans?
Do you remember, or does anybody know, whether Prior ever made a distinction between the problem about quantifying over past objects and quantifying over future objects? Or did Hanscom refer to that?
Yeah, there's a little bit in, I think it's at one point, I think it's in past, present, it may be in time and modality, but I think it's one point in past, present, and future, where he recognizes that if you don't quantify over future objects, well, perhaps you really shouldn't quantify over past objects. And there are some passages where he half toys with it. It's almost as though he recognized that it's a great deal more difficult to do that. So he is aware that it's more difficult. And he's aware that he doesn't really like to, because he does, I think he does still want to say, if to exist is to have things true about you, it's very hard to admit things that used to exist but now don't. So it's almost as though saying, I can see why. I think he certainly knows his opponents are on by far the strongest ground there. The future one is, you can do some of that, of course, with all the stuff about determinism, which I haven't touched on at all. You might be able to use a logical distinction there to do that work. But he is worried. He's aware that maybe he should make an exception there, and half the time he sort of feels the push to doing it. But it's something I think would like to be able to resist, and I think that's in past, present, and future. There may be a bit of that in time and modality, but I think it does come in past, present, and future.
It's actually also interesting that in the notion of the present, at the library, the Balliol library in the archive, which also will come in the Nachlass, there is the notes to the notion of the present, and in that you can see that he began to write about. He wanted to write about that there is a more structure between statements about the past than about possible worlds. So he wanted to sort of begin about distinguishing them, but then he dropped it and did something else.
Yeah, in one of the articles I don't remember whether it's Papers in Logic and Ethics or whether it's in Papers on Time and Tense, he ends up by saying that the hardest thing for tense logicians is most definitely something which is true. He's talking about the extended present, things which are true. I mean, if you say you attended the conference, when did you attend the conference? Well, from then to then. There are lots of statements where it looks like their truth is at an extended interval. Now, you might think that drives a wedge. You might say, well, look, if you think of truth at an instant and then have to go about intervals, you might say, do you do the same with truth at a world? What's the equivalent of an interval? On the other hand, if you think that the way to go is to say that truth is really at an interval, not at an instant, there is a problem. Once you admit intervals, of course, then then if you've got the interval, you've got some of the past in the interval because it's got subintervals, so that it does. But there is the only bit I know is, I can't remember which article it is, but it ends up by saying that truth at an interval is probably the hardest problem for tense logicians.
Might be in the fugitive truth.
It may be. You may be right. It's one of those early ones in one of. I can't remember which of those two books it is, but it's one of the early ones in that one. And fugitive truth kind of sounds right.
Any further questions? Well, thank you, Max. And